We're here for a very important conversation this evening about how boards become effective. And we have the board chairs of 4 finalists from last year's Brooke W. Mahoney Awards, which were established certainly to recognize board excellence, but also to have people who have done this the right way, people who have established best practices, who have shown themselves capable of propelling organizations through distinguished leadership at the board level to help them share their stories with others. And so we're thrilled that you're here tonight. We're thrilled that this is going to tape and that this will be on iTunes University, and it will also be available on CUNY Television later in the season with schedules to be forthcoming. But this conversation is for you, and it is for the larger audience of nonprofit organizations that want to figure out how to deal with the sometimes vexed and vexing relationships between boards and executive directors, among board chairs and members of the board, and among the larger communities that support the work that all of us in this room know to be so very, very important. I am pleased to say that I am joined this evening by 2 of my colleagues on the VCG Governance Matters Board, colleagues who are never vexed or vexing, Carl Rozak and Ann Green. To my immediate left is Amer Bizat, who's the Essex Board Chair of Alwan Foundation for the Arts. To his left is Ted Federici, the Board Chair of Breakthrough New York. To his left is Santushi Kurupu, who is the Board Chair of Saki for South Asian Women. And then finally at the end of the table is Jonathan Gold, the Board Chair of the Edith and Karl Marx Jewish Community House of Bensonhurst. So if we could start, please, and we'll just start right over here, Amer, what Alwan does and what brought you to the board. Then we'll hear that from everybody, and we plunge into a group of questions. Sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me and for attending this what promises to be a very interesting seminar. Alwan, at a very basic level, is a group that intermediates what we call Middle East broadly defined arts between the source and the demand. The source being anybody who's interested in that area, whether it's in musicians, artists, movie makers, intellectual writers as well, and those who demand it, which is the whole New York scene. And by intermediation, we move beyond a simple, let's show what's out there, but to try to do something slightly more profound, to try to bring in a more progressive, more organic form of art that benefits from the New York scene, but at the same time is sourced by the Middle East, by Arab, particularly by Arab art broadly defined. My own interest comes from 2 levels. One, personally, I'm very interested in art. This is something that appeals to me. I have enormous passion for it. But more importantly, I've always felt that Alwan is an idea whose time has finally come. There's a massive thirst for understanding and appreciating what is, at the end of the day, a very rich source of artistic creation, that from the Arab world, at the time when New York wants it, New York needs it, especially after September 11, not to make a cliche out of it, but especially after September 11. So that time has come, and personally I'm interested in it. That's the combination of these 2 things brought me to it.
Terrific, thank you. Ted.
As much passion as he has, I have for the New York City middle school children that we deal with. They are an amalgamation of everything you could ever imagine in the world, but right in the New York City schools. And we help these youngsters through a 8-year commitment on their part to gain access to college. And we're having an enormous success over the last 10 or 11 years, where over 90% of our children complete the course and go on to high schools and college, where they might not have otherwise. And secondly, the other half of that mission is we have what we call students teaching students, in that we give opportunity to people who are thinking about being a teacher to come and work with us during the summer and sometimes during the year to actually teach the children. They, of course, have a mentor teacher with them who makes sure that they are learning what they need to learn and they're teaching what they need to teach. And it's a wonderful opportunity for this community of young people who are learning and young people who want to be teachers to come together and move forward. Personally, I'm in the people business, as my executive director likes to say, Ria, who's sitting down there. One day I was having a pushback with her, and we'll talk more about that, and she looked at me and she said, "You have to understand I'm in the business of saving people." And I went, oh, because she's right. And so my own business is helping people to reach their potential in the business world. And so the marriage for me as a avocation was Breakthrough New York, and that's why I'm there.
Terrific, thank you. Santuji?
So I'm with Saki for South Asian Women, and we simply exist to end violence against women. And we approach this through uniting survivors, the community, and institutions as we work to build healthy communities. And we're celebrating our 25th anniversary in 2 years, and we strongly believe that while we do our direct services with survivors, we need the community to stand up against violence if we want to end it. And we have to participate in policy initiatives because we want to influence and shape the decisions that impact our survivors. So we're basically part of a very large social justice and human rights movement. And my journey with Saki started in '06. I started as a volunteer, and I stepped into a staff position as a volunteer for 2 years. And as I was transitioning out of that, they asked me to join the board.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I'm John Gold, the chairman of the Marks JCH in Bensonhurst. We are a community center and community-based social services agency, a fairly broad social services agency. We have what we call a 360-degree approach and life cycle approach. So it's everything from traditional community center programs like preschool and early childhood programs, day camp, after-school programs, through things like job training and job placement. We've acted as a resettlement house we have a largely immigrant population, have acted as a resettlement house for over 60,000 people from the former Soviet Union, although we have a broader immigrant community. And so we help with things like citizenship and entitlement to services. We have a senior housing complex, meals for seniors, a fairly broad range of services. I came to the JCH about 10 years ago as an observer under a program that UJA, which is our largest funder, has, and an agency that I've since joined the board of, under their observership program, which gives people an opportunity to see the agencies that they fund at work, and over time wound up joining the board and becoming much more active in the organization.
Terrific, thank you. Lesson number 1. Board chairs can distill their passion in a synoptic vision of an organization that compels commitment and shows people why they're there. Now, all of you do that with great distinction. Is that true for everybody on your board? Do you have problems sometimes getting somebody to be able to be as articulate as you are about what you do and what the organization does? Nope, never happened?
Happy to take that if you'd like.
Please do.
Well, clearly that's going to be a challenge anytime you bring a large group of people into the same room and try and get them to leave the room and articulate even what's happened there in the last few minutes. It'll be interesting if I try and stop you each at the door and see how you communicate what this session contained. All of it likely will be valid, but it may not be consistent, and somebody who wasn't in the room may feel like they're touching a piece of the elephant when they hear each of you recount what was there. We've gone through a deliberate strategic process, which we do every few years with the board. We involve the whole group and try to get buy-in to the vision and mission of the agency, and to the extent that it's evolved, to be sure that everybody is on board with the direction it's evolving in and how we communicate what we do. We think we do a reasonably effective job in that. Nonetheless, if you were to stop everybody at the door of our board meeting as they stepped out, I'd say we'd get 80% of the way there, maybe 85. It's a challenge.
But this is something that you directly try to educate to during your board retreats, to build these competencies.
If one doesn't do it, it's a guarantee that it would be like asking the folks leaving the room about it, and you will get a piece of the elephant each time. So one needs to make a concerted effort with little question.
Great. Ted?
Yeah, the way we go about it is because we're a fairly new 501c3. We've been at it for 12 years, but up till about 3 years ago, we were a committee off another major board of a school. And we went out on our own about 3 years ago, and we were very careful about the people that we asked to come on the board in a full-time way. So we've had a unique opportunity to develop the board with people who not only had the passion for what we were doing, but also had the knowledge and could do the elevator speech in 2 minutes. And I would say, by and large, each and every one of our board people, we have a small board, about 12 or 13 people at the moment. And they are a working board. Each of them belongs to a committee, and those committees function, and they're expected to deliver. They do not do the staff job. We keep a very bright line between that boundary. But the things that they can do, they commit to do, we hold them accountable to do.
And accountability is very important on boards. I want to loop back to that in a moment, but staying on this notion of trying to get people to be able to express the mission. Santoshi, you've now been around for 25 years, not you, but the organization. So you've got a whole generation through the process. Do you find more challenges as people who have joined the board at different phases have different visions of what you're up to, or has there been a constant renorming along the way? And if so, how do you do that?
I think we have evolved from being very much a grassroots, only working with survivors, to now taking it to this social justice, human rights movement. And we do have to bring along our founders, our supporters, and we try to do that through, just our newsletters, keeping everyone engaged in the things we're doing, because it doesn't happen overnight. It's just we evolve. But as for board, I think for us, our board is so in touch with each other, just given the work we do, the calls we have, that I would say everyone does have their elevator speech down, and I think we all have to use it quite often. So it does help when the board is very much in tune with what the organization does, because it just helps. And the board is always in the know. We have a great ED and communication is very open.
And we want to get back to EDs too in just a moment. But first, Amir, let me ask
No, thanks.
you to weigh in here.
In many ways, I mean, the question is fairly a practical one, and I'll get back to that in a second. But I personally found I've ended up being the person who recruited most of the board, and I've always found that walking into a meeting with a very well-defined vision, with a very well-defined objective is probably the most important thing. You have to go there and you have to woo these people. You have to tell them about something that excites them. And the excitement could be both philanthropic or more spiritual, as it were, or it could actually be practical. I mean, unfortunately, this is the practicality of it, the element of prestige. Sort of, what does it mean to be on the board? What does it mean for you personally? So the first thing that needs is you have to come up with a very well-defined vision that appeals and excites the person that you're trying to woo. Once you bring them in, that's clearly not enough, and so we're close to enough. Once you bring them in, I completely agree with Santoshi. Communication strategy is crucial, and we don't always do it very well. But the notion of always talking to them, always sending them emails, always telling them what's happening and how it fits with the image that you sold them originally becomes absolutely crucial. But at the end of the day, and this is the point that I cannot overemphasize, the notion that everybody on the board is the same is naive. They're not. There's the notion that all of them are going to be just as involved, just as excited, and just as forthcoming. It just doesn't work, at least not in my real life. You have to separate them into buckets. There is the occasional person who writes the check. And at the end of the day, writing the check is an incredibly important part of what we need them for. There's the person who wants to be involved in the programming, wants to be involved in the actual day-to-day operation. And then there's the person who actually who wants to be somewhere in the middle, who wants to be occasionally brought into a meeting and occasionally not. And then you have to figure out which person is which. Which person just wants to lend his name and his money, and which person wants to be every day with you. And that's not an easy balance to reach.
And is that the board chair's responsibility to make that assessment, to try to figure out where people fit into the spectrum of board service?
From my perspective, the answer is unfortunately, is yes. That's very much so. You need the support of the executive director. In our case, you need the support, crucially, of the founder, the person who's the engine behind L1. He's somebody whose role is crucial, and every organization has that kind of person. And at the end of the day, ends up being a partnership between the MBA and the MFA.
Ted, did you want to get back into this?
Just the thought that the other thing that really does bring the organization together at the board level is the fact that we bring program into the board room every time we have a board meeting. And the other thing is that we have an opportunity all during the year, and our board people are invited to go in and help and be at the actual sites for different kinds of opportunities. For example, when we bring the parents and the youngsters in who are being looked at as a possible candidate, the board actually goes and helps with the interviews. We're trained, the staff trains us, we know what to do, how to do it. So that allows people to feel that they are really touching the mission of what we do, and so that's a very important piece. Ours is kind of a living, dynamic operation, if you will, because we're dealing with young, wonderful people who are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and if they were just sitting in the middle schools in the public school system, they might be overlooked because they're doing so well. And there are so many youngsters who are not doing well, and everybody's focused on them, and so we open the window for the kids who are doing well, and we bring them together, and we'll ask them a question. I remember one said, I like being here because I'm a geek in my own school, but here, everybody's a geek. So that is a kind of, and the board understands that and is part of that.
And of course, everybody on the board is a geek, in their own way. Let me talk about that, and let me pivot the conversation a little bit to accountability, because this is hard. It's always hard to think about accountability with volunteer workforce. It's very difficult to think about volunteer accountability when the volunteers are the people driving strategy for the organization. How do you do that? How do you have difficult conversations with people who are perhaps not holding up? I mean, noting that there will be a variety of roles that people are asked to play, respectively, in the organization. How do you have those conversations, or is it better to get out ahead of those conversations with some kind of formal engagement?
You know, interesting you ask that, because we're living it right now as we develop and we build our board. And we have a strategy and a plan. We have a governance board, which is very active, a committee. And we have a chair, and we've been trained, and the people are trained. And when a potential board member is coming in, we make sure that they are vetted by not only the governance committee chair, but the ED, of course, and then either me or the vice chair. And at the end of the day, we'll make sure that that person fully understands their responsibility. Then they get to sign a document that says, here's your responsibilities, and we call them the Miranda rights. And, but in a sense, what you don't want is cameo appearances.
Right.
What you don't want is, I'm in it for myself. And so one of the ways you do that is to be absolutely transparent and clear as to what your expectations are for a board member. And when they're not doing it, then I, as a board chair or a vice chair of the ED, feel perfectly comfortable in talking to them about it.
So the ED sometimes has that conversations rather than you.
She's our keeper.
Right.
I mean, the ED runs the show. She really does.
Okay. I know that a couple of you use function grids, expertise, function on the board. Can those of you who are doing that talk about how that fits into a sort of oversight and compliance regime?
Happy to take that. We do, at least as we, 3 or 4 years ago, we went through a deliberate process to look at the diversity of the board, to look at the function boxes that our board members fit into, to take a step back and assess, much to your point, who is engaged and who is not engaged. And as we had a new executive director and CEO, to take it as our responsibility to figure out how to engage each of the board members, and to the extent that we couldn't, to have the difficult conversations and to transition them away from the board. That was, just to answer your earlier question, that was a relatively straightforward process, because quite frankly, we have a set of expectations. The question is, you know, you're not living up to the expectations. We all know that since the expectations are out. What are we doing wrong? How do we engage you? What are you passionate about? And to the extent that you can't, is it a natural moment to transition? And some folks are relieved, quite frankly, to have that dialogue because it allows the transition. The functional boxes are easier because invariably, over the course of the year, issues pop up. And to the extent that one has a team of lawyers with different areas of expertise, without a question, we call on them and we save a dramatic amount of money and get a lot more passionate engagement than we do from any law firm that we hire. It's the same thing across the spectrum, quite frankly, and you get much better engagement when you come to somebody with their area of expertise and say, we're not having you turn up for a volunteer day where you plant flowers, but quite frankly, you get paid $1,000 an hour as a lawyer or $1,000 an hour as an IT specialist. Here's the issue that we're having, help us solve it. And there's just tremendous leverage out of doing that and unbelievable engagement that we get, and I think we have been incredibly gratified by the results from that.
All of you, when you, and whether you use a formal function grid or not, when you're recruiting new members of the board, do you recruit for function or do you recruit for fit in a relatively more sort of social and chemical way?
Let me try to take that, and that sort of fits back to, or I can, if you don't mind, I'm going to loop back to the first question as well,
Sure.
because it's something that we've struggled with quite a bit, and in a second I'll tell you how we're shifting, what is the bias that we're shifting towards. The original idea 7-8 years ago when we started doing the board structure, both the executive board and what we call the advisory board, we decided we want to keep it organic. We decided that we wanted to keep it as fluid as possible. And there were two reasons for why we thought so. One is because we felt that board engagement is something that develops organically over time. And the idea that you can get somebody committed the way I am committed, the way somebody who's been with us for a while from day one is naive. It doesn't work that way. So you need to grow them into, the term I always use is you have to buy their loyalty. You have to get them to the point where they become so excited. And that doesn't happen on day one. And the notion that we can actually force them into committing something immediately was I thought, was not something that we should be doing there. And the second reason is I've also felt, and I know this is not in the literature, I know that the board's academicians probably disagree with me, but I've also felt that it's much better for retainment, for getting the maximum out of people, is to get it to do it themselves rather than force them into doing something. So the organic approach of more fluidity, step by step, over time, tell us what you get excited about, was something that we built. And I have to say, to a large extent, that has worked. That has not been a disaster. That has allowed us to build by now 7 people executive committee, and we're up to 20 people in the advisory board, all of whom are, to some extent or the other, quite engaged. My bias is shifting. And now I can see why that approach can be inefficient. And why now that we have a critical mass of people who are sufficiently interested, now I'm getting to the point where I want to start committing them further. Because honestly, it gets exhausting after a while to continuously be buying people's loyalty. At some point, you wanted the outset. So my emphasis remains the fluid, organic, step by step, but I'm starting to get more and more committed, so asking for commitments.
You raise an issue that many of you wrote about in your applications, and that is, in addition to the board itself, the use of advisory boards or junior boards or fundraising committees comprised of people outside of the board. Do all of you do that? And I mean, obviously, that's a layer of complexity. How do you manage that and define roles?
Again, it's very clearly a strategy that one has to have, a conscious strategy of how are you going to build and develop a board. In our organization, we consistently talk about management succession, both from a board and a staff point of view. And so as we began to develop this board, we looked at people in certain age brackets, and we went to the people just out of college and under 30, building their ways, and we put together a young professionals organization and allowed them to grow and develop and touch the mission as much as they wanted to or could. But yet we gave them a charter and someone to work with them so that they had real work to do. And the hope there is, as they move on in life, they will be the succession to the main board. So we're building people who are coming out of college, looking to build a life, looking to build a career, and to have something else, a place to give back. And that we're doing it that way here. The other thing we do is on some committees, I agree with what you were saying before. We find that all the expertise you need is never on the board. And so you have to be able to develop volunteers. And we say to our committees, for example, we have one, our communications committee, we purposely said, we don't want anybody from the board but you to be on that committee. Now, because you're in that field, would you go out and find volunteers from your world, the advertising world, to bring them together? And if you can excite them and we can get work done at the same time, then guess what? You also then have potential new board members. So we've kind of worked it very carefully that way through succession.
All of you individually have backgrounds primarily in the business world, many of you in finance, and you're working in organizations, you're leading organizations that are obviously in social services in different dimensions, cultural organizations in different dimensions. How do you get expertise that speaks to the mission on the board, or do you hope to get that primarily out of the staff side? What's the balance that you see in the conversation on the board with business stewardship of the activities that you're substantively engaged in at the organizational level?
We take a view that the programmatic side of what we do is really driven by the staff and the needs of the community. Different organizations have clearly different approaches to this, but ultimately, we need those closest to the coalface to make the assessment and to make recommendations relative to that. And so it's an organic process, but it's a bottoms-up organic process. I'm not sure that speaks to communicating the mission, but communicating the mission is less a challenge. Creating the programs, growing and evolving what we do in a difficult funding environment, and communicating to those who are interested in funding the sorts of programs that that are essential to the community is really a partnership, quite frankly. And so one would often have both staff and board members in the room as we're out having those dialogues.
And that's going to be a pivot in just a moment to talk about relationships with staff. But first, I'd like to ask Santushi, you're dealing in an organization where most of your clientele has experienced a measure of trauma, and it's not unusual in such cases to try to have somebody in those circumstances on the board. Do you make a specific effort to do that? And if not, how do you try to encounter for board members the nature of that trauma and fold it into the practice of board stewardship?
So we don't try to get survivors who've worked with our organization onto a board level. It's not something you do deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
But we give enough opportunity for board members to work with staff and within our programming areas for them to have that one-on-one experience. A lot of our board members are from the nonprofit, and so they have their experience is different from those on our board with the corporate experience.
Mm-hmm.
But we do provide that. It's not a deliberate decision that we want to have survivors on our board because we work with survivors of violence, because I think there's a whole other issue to that.
Yes.
Which, you can reopen trauma. It's not deliberate, but for those board members who do want to experience the one-on-one and share that level of programming, we do try and engage them in the work.
Amer, you talked about having the MBA and the MFA sitting side by side on the board. What's the MFA role?
That's a crucial, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's really at the heart of the tension and the stress in any organization, I think of all of us, of how do you, and I'm going to try to be fair here, even though I come to it from the MBA side, I'm going to try to give both sides. How do you reconcile this inherent tension? On the one hand, to take an organization to the next stage, you need to corporatize it. An element of professionalization, an element of institutionalization becomes very important. Notions of budget constraints, cash flow analysis, processes of how decisions get taken over time, staffing, HR, procurement, website. There's all sorts of forms of corporatization that is absolutely necessary. Now, clearly, there's a tension here. I'm going to talk on the MFA side. Clearly, there's an element of tension there because overly corporatizing and overly institutionalizing an organization whose raison d'etre at the end of the day is one of creativity, one of an element of amateurishness. And that's the whole idea why this organization survives can start getting constrained and starts getting suffocated by too much corporate. And that tension is, at the end of the day, an incredibly important stumbling block of how to move the next direction. The way we're doing it, in all honesty, is through trial, is in 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I've personally taken the decision the view that we need to bring in of staff whose job is not, in our case, on the programming side. There's a need for a chief operating officer, the equivalent of a chief operating officer, a person who does the day-to-day running of the business. It has nothing to do with the creative side whatsoever. And that tension is always going to be there in terms of the role of that person, the marginal maneuver the person is allowed, the reporting. Does he or she report to the creative crowd or the board, the corporate? It's a two-step forward, one-step backwards. That's honestly the hardest part of what we do.
So keeping that tension in balance and keeping it fruitful is part of the job.
Or at least, I wish we could turn it into a fruitful, but at least keeping it moving ahead.
Okay.
Because you don't want that tension to stop, to create paralysis. And it can. Honestly, it can. And make sure that it doesn't ever get to the point where it breaks, where the corporate crowd say, you know what, I don't want to work with these people because they don't understand the importance of budget constraints. And we don't want the creative staff to walk away saying, those guys are, money people, ideologically constraining us through too many balance sheets.
Tim?
Yeah, it's clearly a conversation between the ED and the chair of the board so that you can avoid as much of the trial and error that Amir is talking about. And that conversation has to come from transparency, understanding the difference in the two roles, the role of the board chair, the role of the ED and the staff, and knowing that there's, as we all know, a certain kind of positive tension is good. To keep an organization in balance, you need to push-pull. And I think that so long as the ED and the chair are in absolute sync about what the differences in the roles are, and the ED has the most difficult job in the world because she has or he has got to balance the program needs of the constituencies with the needs or the desires of the board, and it's a very difficult position that the ED walks. And when you meet a good ED, you know it.
Right. Let's pivot to EDs, because this is clearly a very critical relationship in any organization. David, could you give us a minute, by the way? No, just kidding. This is plainly the person who, stay. This is clearly the person who's going to get most of what has to get done in terms of executive management of the organization, but you've got the policy setting agenda coming out of the board, at least ideally. Talk a little bit about how you manage that relationship. I couldn't agree with you more. This is an enormously difficult position. But I've seen different boards and different EDs deal with this in different ways, that, sort of board policing and management belongs to the board chair, never the ED, sometimes the other way around, sometimes a mix of both. Talk a little bit about how you do that, and why don't we start with you, John?
Well, and Alex, who's our CEO and ED, is in the room too. I won't ask you to leave, Alex. I think, quite frankly, it's a lot like the for-profit world. It's all about managing the relationships, and it's about being sure that there's a constructive relationship, that everyone's trying to get to the right answer rather than worrying about being the one with the right answer. It's how do you have a constructive process so that you can sit down and say, I totally disagree with you. And it's also interesting because we have a social services, we manage a social services agency. It means many of the folks that work there come up from that side, have that view of life. We have a board that has a lot of folks from the finance and private equity world. The difficulty with folks from the private equity world, and I come from that world, is that we're often wrong but never in doubt. On the social services side, the issue, of course, is that folks that come up from that side always want to get to consensus, and they want to have a very smooth process. And so one has to learn to negotiate those differences in a constructive way to get to the best answer. I think we do a pretty good job of doing that, but it's always a challenge. It's like a marriage. One needs to work on it.
The consensus thing is really a surprise for many people coming out of, whether it's financial services or other aspects of corporate America, that's a shock. Did you find the same thing, Santushi, and how do you deal with it on the board and relationships with the ED?
Yes, the consensus building is a little warm and fuzzy, but I think it's very necessary. And I think the relationship between board chair and ED is so essential. And I spend a lot of time on that relationship because, so on our board we have 4 working committees. And the ED is part of each of those committees. And we ask board members to be part of 2 committees. And so in addition to, obviously, those meetings and conversations, I meet with the board, with the ED at least twice a month, depending on what's happening. And it's not really to keep tabs, but it's just to keep that dialogue. It's to keep, give space for her and me to have those discussions and to make sure that the board is being represented to her and her needs are being represented to the board. And I think that communication is really is very important. And coming to consensus, I think it's very easy sometimes when you don't get the feedback you want or board members are busy and they don't give you their feedback to say, okay, I think we should just do this. But I try not to do that because I want everyone to have a voice. And whether everyone agrees or not, it's important to have that dialogue so that the decision that comes out, everyone feels like they're part of it and they've had a voice.
Ted?
I think the magic word is trust. And that is what brings together the corporate and the program side. And if you define trust as integrity, goodwill, people feeling both sides that goodwill exists, keeping commitments, and consistent behavior. When those things are in place, you know that there is trust. When any one of those gets broken, trust gets broken. And so we work very hard in our world between the ED and the board to keep trust going. Transparency in the sense that my sense as being a board chair is that I am pleased and proud that the ED will call me and sometimes just say, I need to talk to you. Not about something going on between the board, but just about something. And vice versa, I learn more every day from being around my ED about the things that I don't know. So it's that kind of openness and trust that is the magic for me.
Amir, do you consciously discuss the relationship, the responsibilities, and the responsibility splits between yourself and the ED?
If you don't mind, let me step backwards and give you a little bit color about the structure that we have, because our
Sure.
structure is slightly different than what I think is a traditional. Most of the work that is being done on the substantive level is done by volunteers. We have a number of curators all of whom are actual volunteers. They're fairly senior, extremely established in their areas, and to a large extent, they report, or they are, report is too strong of a word, but they're incredibly influenced by the founder, by the person who started the creative effort, and who happens to have just walked in here. As well. And so you have that group of people who are not on the staff, but they do the significant amount of the creative work. And then you have the board that's also made out of volunteers who are trying to create more of the corporate structure onto a volunteer group. Finally, so what we've decided recently is on an experiment of trying to create a group in the middle, which is what we call an executive director, the chief operating officer, the person who runs the organization on a day-to-day basis. And that's a new effort for us. So it's more of an intermediary, more of somebody who sits on both sides of the fence. On the one hand, focuses on the budget, focuses on the processes, wants to make it more professional, but at the same time, works extremely closely with the curators, extremely closely with the creative crowd. My own relationship as the chair has been that I'm extremely close to the founder, to Ahmed. We talk, he happens to also be an extremely close friend of mine as well. We end up talking enormously with each other. And recently, we've noticed that it's important to introduce also the new executive director into that conversation to actually be able to intermediate the need for creative freedom within a budget constraint. So it's become a triangular relationship between the board, between the founder, who's really the engine behind Alwan, and the person who is more the chief operating officer. So I don't know if that's a clear answer, but that's the experiment that we're trying right now.
No, that helps a lot. At VCG Governance Matters, we made a deliberate choice to have a board chair and an ED with the same first name. Therefore, we maintain plausible deniability. It was him. He did it. Works brilliantly. Let me, you've raised the question about founding EDs, and there is, of course, a long history of discussion of founderitis, which can become, I'm not suggesting here, but can become problematic as boards try to do things that aren't necessarily consistent with the vision of a founding ED, but increasingly come to typify the interests of the board as it evolves. Have any of you dealt with that? And if so, how have you dealt with that?
Okay, I should go ahead. Maybe you should leave the room.
You know it's getting good if we have to ask people to leave the room. That's important.
Again, just to emphasize, he's one of my closest friends, so I feel very comfortable talking about this. And I'm going to be as objective as possible because I know it's an issue that many nonprofits fight. When you have most of these organizations get created by an individual, right? Most of these organizations, and to take it to the level that we're at right now, 15 years into right, when you're already a larger organization, you know that you're talking about somebody who is not just extremely driven, energetic, but also extremely intelligent. And it takes a kind of a drive and a kind of raw intelligence and raw ambition to be able to take it that level. And that's categorically a good thing, right? That's clearly why the organization is as successful as it is. There's a certain point, though, where the organization needs to go beyond that individual, right? And it has to grow to the point where, I mean, I've given this example when we met, the Joseph Papp in the public theater, where at some point the public theater became bigger than him, but he was completely comfortable with that growth. He was very comfortable with the organization becoming bigger than him, but he's still the engine behind it. And now, that's not always straightforward with people who are as intelligent, as driven, as ambitious as the Joseph Papps of the world. And again, it's a two-step forward, one-step backward in that operation. I mean, eventually, I'd love to hear his thoughts as well, since, sorry.
And we'll have an opportunity to bring those in just a little while. Anybody else had any similar kind of experience? John?
We're an 85-year-old institution, so the closest we come to
Founding
founders...
ED, not an issue anymore.
Well, we do have a 94-year-old woman who, when she was 9 years old, danced to raise money to start the organization, but she's a member and client at this moment. The issue that one does have, which is a great problem to my way of thinking, is cult of personality. People support people, and to the extent that you have a strong leader, you do develop some cult of personality. The question is, how do you balance it out? When we ran our, and I'll embarrass Alex a little bit, but when we had our 85th anniversary dinner, the local newspaper ran a headline that said Budnitsky hosts a party because he's a cult of personality, because he has a cult of personality in the community, and because people like to come out and support him, and we raised a record amount for a community-based organization really based on that. So it's a balancing act because, of course, we have 250 people that work there over the course of the year, and one needs to have a broader organization, but people like to work with people.
Yes. Ted?
You know, it's probably not appropriate for this forum, but in not so much founder problems, but when you have an organization that is part of a national organization, that can pose a different set of problems where you've got national board with their agenda, and you've got local boards with their agenda, and you cross often on the fundraising and on the mission side. But probably not appropriate here, but that takes a lot of managing on both the board, local board, and on the ED's part to make that happen.
Is the relationship close enough with UJA to be confounding in that way for you, John?
It certainly can be. There's things like a fundraising charter that UJA has that while they're managing their campaign, and we are not allowed to throw fundraising events at the JCH. Now, I sit on the UJA board as well, so it's a balancing act, but we have a very close relationship, which largely is a constructive one, but there's no question that there are tensions, and to run a larger organization, you've got a lot more process, you've got a lot more people, which they do, and as a result, sometimes the processes and procedures can be quite confounding.
I am going to ask one more question, and then I want to go out to your questions. So let me please ask you, if you're thinking about questions, to line up behind that microphone in the center, and I will get out to you in just a second or two. You've all talked about being able to involve board members with work through engaging them with staff. There is a difference of opinion about how permeable staff and board relationships should be, with some organizations relatively locked down as kind of, oh my God, there's a staff member talking to a board member, and others quite a bit more conjoint in that way. Can you talk a little bit about the philosophies that have driven you towards staff-board relationships and what you think about them, whether you try to govern them in any way?
I'll try that for a little bit. I think it's really the power of the ED in the sense of the EDs that I've worked with in a number of organizations. If they've had the confidence and the joy of life and people to be able to bring together different kinds of people to do different things and to be the glue, is really the heart of the organization.
So essentially, if the ED has the generosity of vision to allow that, but that gets back to the transparency and trust thing you were talking about earlier, right? Anybody else think of thoughts on this?
Well, I probably have slightly controversial views on it because my view, again, on both the for-profit and not-for-profit side, is that confident leadership is thrilled to have engagement with the board. There's not enough hours in the day to build relationships with all of the board members and leave it just on a CEO or executive director's head. For a board to have confidence in the organization, they need to develop those relationships. It's fantastic exposure for the staff. As a general rule, assuming that the board is trained and knows what their role is, it's fantastic for the board members. The key there is that the board needs to understand what their role is,
Right.
Is one of the rules of engagement, but I think it's critically important.
Santucci?
I completely agree. I think it's great to have the interaction and to get to know the staff and the board. I think the board needs to know its role. And I think it's a bit of a balancing act because you don't want to have staff go over the ED and come to the board. And so you have to be careful in that interaction, and you want it to be genuine, but at the same time, you don't want to blur that line because, especially at Saki, we have a board, we have the ED, we have the staff. It's a very clear-cut hierarchy, and we don't want staff to start coming to the board with questions or problems and not, kind of bypassing the ED. So it's a balancing act, but I do think overall it's healthy to have board and staff interact.
And Amir, I assume you're going to agree with that.
To a large extent, with one sort of minor caveat, which is another part of the experiment over the past year for us has been also, which I'm sure a lot of people have as well, is creating a development officer as well. Somebody whose job is more in terms of fundraising, but also the conceptualization of the message. That person, I think, will and has and will continue to have unobstructed relationship with the board. That's a crucial part of what they do, is the network and the contact, the fundraising. The more complicated the question is going to be what I call the chief operating officer, right? The person who runs the organization on a day-to-day basis. And there, it is an issue between do you talk to the program officers, what we call curators, or do you go all the time to the board? And I guess it's going to have to be, has been and will continue to be a case by case. When there are certain things that a board member can offer help on finance, on processes, on IT, then they should talk to the board member. But that shouldn't be the issue for every single program, for every single event. There they have they have Ahmad, and they have the program directors, the curators to talk to.
Terrific. I want to go out to the questions.
Hi, my name is Barbara Paxton. We talk about effective boards, but many organizations have trouble just finding people. Their policy is anyone who wants to join us and write us a check, please. So what do you guys find are your best source for new board members?
We find that if we pick the right one or two board members and we ask them as they're coming in, we vet them very, very carefully. It's not a matter of, can you write a check and come join us? We want people of substance. We want people who we believe will either love the mission or will eventually love the mission as we expose them to it, but we also know that they will duplicate themselves, and that's part of bringing them in. And we're finding that.
Santucci?
I think it's a tricky question because if you have a great board dynamic where everyone is committed, everyone works, everyone gives the money, but maybe not the big check. So do you bring in people who write the big check and don't do any work? And how does that affect the dynamic of the board? And, so that's something we are always questioning, because we have a great board dynamic, and we're an active board, and we don't want to have people who say, well, I'm just writing the big check, but I'm not coming for meetings, and I'm not doing X, Y, and Z. So I don't know, but I think as far as how we do recruitment is we have an active spreadsheet, literally, listing all the criteria we need, and that's also organic and growing. And we just keep putting names into it. And when a need comes and we look at the spreadsheet, and if we've identified someone, then we'll have a discussion, go out, speak, and recruit.
Anything to add, John?
The challenge for us has become, as we've been more and more successful at having an engaged dynamic board, we have specific things we're looking for. How, in a lot of ways, do you find someone who's going to be incredibly engaged? Because there are a lot of candidates that come forward that can write the checks and that are interested in being involved. It's a networking game in terms of where they come from. There's a number of programs that folks like Robin Hood and UJ have to bring candidates to us. And we almost go through a hazing process, I would say, or an engagement process. You have to come to board meetings for a period of time and observe the process. You have to find something specific, and generally if they're getting engaged in the process, that you have a passion for and where you can make a difference. And so nobody gets invited to join the board after they come and meet a couple of members of the board. They get to know everybody in the room. They get to know the agency, and then we get to make an informed decision on both sides.
Okay. We'll allow Mr. LaGreca to have our last question.
I am so reminded of the times that we spent with all four of you during the selection process last year, and the quality of the passion that the four of you have for what you do. It is totally within the context and the sense of why we decided to bring this award to our community, because you reflect such different models and such passion for what you do. It's just, I can't tell you how delightful it is to hear the four of you talk, and how different. There is no one good governance model, and you will never achieve nirvana. You're always on that journey to making it better. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you.
And before I ask you to join me in thanking the board with your applause, I'd like to invite Jack Krauskopf at the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management here in Baruch to say a few words from our other co-sponsor.
I'm really here just to thank this panel for the wise experience that we've all been able to benefit from hearing. I think maybe we could have had a subtitle for this, Board Chairs Matter, because they clearly do, and we got a good dose of that today. And thank David for leading such an effective conversation to elicit all the experience that we've heard about, and Dave LaGreca for bringing this event to Baruch. We appreciate that. This is one in our series that our Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management does every month for people working in the nonprofit sector. We'd like to hear what you thought about this event, so please tell us that. Tell us what future events you'd like us to do, and thank you all for being here. Thanks again to the panel and to David.
Good events. Thank you, Jack. Good events have many parents, and this is also a Governance Matters Roundtable. Usually those are in the morning at 8:30. There is another one starting on October 18th entitled How Can Boards Protect Their Organizations from Legal Risks? We do invite you to come, and you can get more information from that signing up outside, and we do hope that we have all of your contact information for those purposes. So lots of good places to talk about how to do this well. I want to offer my own thanks to members of the board, to the board chairs, my fellow board chairs here today. Board chairs do matter. You're right about that, Jack. But one of the things that I heard very insistently here is a quartet of board chairs very keenly attuned to mission, but mission in the context of the different needs and different appetites that people bring to the process of making these organizations work. And I want to applaud all of you for your sensitivity to that, and clearly your deft management of expectations and your ability to place that in the context of missions that inspire. Thank you for this, thank you for being here, and thank you for all the good work that you do. Please join me. Thank you.